So this is the part 2 of our discussion for adjusting. So last meeting, we finished adjusting the accounts. So last meeting, we finished your recollections. So again, just a review. We have deferrals and accruals. Deferrals and accruals. So for your deferrals, you have either deferrals of expense or deferral of an income. A deferral of an expense is known as prepayment, and a deferral of an income is known as pre-collection. For your accruals, you have accruals of expense and accruals of income. Your accruals of expense is known as your accrued expense, and your accruals of income is known as your accrued income. Okay, so for your deferrals of expense, we're not yet done with this. So our topic for today will start with deferrals of expense, accrued expense, and then we end with accrued income. So let's start now with your deferred expense. Deferred expense, or also known as your prepayments. So what is a deferred expense or a prepayment? So these are costs that expire either through the passage of time or through use. So cost that expires either through passage of time or through use. Okay? So when you say through passage of time, that prepayment normally is for a certain period of time. So for example, your prepaid insurance and your insurance is good for 2 years. So your prepayment is only good for 2 years. It is based on passage of time. For use, you prepaid that particular asset already, but it will only be used by the business some other time. So some examples are your supplies and your depreciable assets. Supplies and your depreciable assets. So later, we will all discuss these items. Okay, so what is the pro forma entry under your deferrals? So your deferrals or expense is composed of two mixed accounts. So what is the mixed account here? Asset and expense. Therefore, your pro forma entry can either be a debit to an asset and a credit to cash, or a debit to expense and a credit to cash. Okay. So for deferred expense again, what will we split? We split your asset and your expense account. So what is your pro forma entry? Your pro forma entry is a debit to asset or a credit to cash, or a debit to expense and a credit to cash. Okay, so therefore, we can learn here based on this two mixed accounts that we have two methods of recording a prepayment. And what are those? First is your asset method. Next is your expense method. So again, we look at it as how it is initially recognized. So initially, if you are using asset method, we initially record it as an asset. If you are using an expense method, you will initially record it as an expense. Okay. And then on your adjusting, if initially you use your asset method, your adjusting is you should recognize an expense at amount expired. If initially you recorded it as an expense, on your adjusting, you recognize an asset at amount unexpired. Okay, so again, based on your mixed account, we have either asset or expense. The asset is represented by the unexpired portion, and the expense is represented by the expired portion. Okay, so if ever we use this, then we need to make our journal entries based on this method. So initially, under your asset method, we record an expense. Initially, we record an asset. We adjust by recording an expense at amount expired. For your expense method, initially, we record it at an expense. We adjust it by recording an asset at amount unexpired. Okay, so let's have our pro forma entries. So we have your asset and you have your expense method. Asset and expense method. So initially, at the time of prepayment, so under asset method, what did we say we record as an asset? So we debit a prepaid asset, we credit cash. Okay. Now, going to your subsequent or your adjusting. So in our adjusting, sabi rin natin, under asset method, we record an expense. Wait, baka mas maguluhan kayo. So dito tayo guys. So asset method. Ayan. So asset method, initially we record it as an asset. Adjusting is an expense. We record an expense at amount expired. So in your adjusting, we should record an expense. So we debit expense. And we remove the amount in your prepaid asset at amount expired. So the expired amount. Okay. So this one is the expired amount. How about on your expense method? So under expense method, we use other color. Ayan. So under expense method, we initially record it as an expense. So we debit your expense and we credit cash. And then our adjusting is by recording an asset at amount unexpired. So debit your prepaid asset, credit expense. At what amount? At the amount unexpired. Okay, so again, we just follow this rule. So again, what is a prepayment? A prepayment is an expense or cost that expires either through passage of time or through use. So when you say passage of time, over time, you expire a portion. While through use, an amount is only expired once it is used. And there are two methods in recording your prepayment. You have your asset method and your expense method. Under asset method, initially we record it as an asset. Our adjusting is by recording an expense at amount expired. If we use your expense method, then initially we record an expense, and our adjusting, we record an asset at amount unexpired. Why? Because here, take note, we just need to split the unexpired and expired portion. Therefore, we need to set up either asset or expense. Okay, so for your asset, you initially recorded it as an asset. However, you have an expired portion. So you need to recognize the expired portion out of that asset. Kaya nga yung entry mo ay debit expense at credit prepaid asset. Kasi binabawasan mo na yung prepaid asset dun sa amount na nag-expire. Paano naman dun sa expense method? So initially, ni-record mo siya sa expense, pero meron pa pala dun na hindi nagagamit or hindi pa nag-expire. Therefore, you should debit a prepaid asset just to recognize the amount unexpired or not yet used. Okay? So that's for our pro forma entries. To properly understand it, let's have an example. Purchase a 6-month insurance costing 24,000 pesos on October 30, 2020. Record the adjusting entry on December 31, 2020. Okay, purchase a 6-month insurance costing 24,000 on October 30, 2020. Record the adjusting entry on December 31, 2020. So we have here 24,000. What is the period for the 24,000? The period for the 24,000 is? Okay, so the period for the 24,000 is for 6 months. It is good for 6 months. Since it is good for 6 months, how much is per month? How much is per month? So 24,000 divided by 6, our per month is 4,000. Now, that 4,000, we have a portion expired and a portion unexpired. Okay, so if ever the portion is already expired, ilang months yung expired dito? So, this is true passage of time, tama? Kasi nga 6 months siya. So, true passage of time. So, ano yung passage of time na natin? That is October 30 to December 31. October 30 to December 31. So, ilang months yan? November, December. So, this is only 2 months. Now, the unexpired, kung 2 months yung expired, edi 6 months less 2 months, we have 4 months unexpired. We have 4 months unexpired. So since 4 months yung unexpired and 2 months yung expired, nahati na natin yung 6 months. So magkano yung value ng 2 months? So 2 months times 4,000 will give us 8,000. So this is the expired portion. Clear? Next, as to our unexpired portion, so 4 months multiplied by 4,000 per month, this will give us 16,000 pesos. This is the unexpired portion. Unexpired portion. So we're ready to make our entries under asset method and under expense method. So we start first with asset method. So initially, how do we record the prepayment in your asset? Initially, we record it as an asset. Therefore, we debit prepaid insurance because the asset is an insurance amounting to 24,000 and i-credit to cash for 24,000 pesos. And then, we also record now our adjusting entry. So adjusting entry. In our adjusting entry, what did we say under asset method? We go back. So sabi natin under asset method, we debit an expense and we credit a prepaid asset. So ang debit natin daw dito ay expense. And then ang credit natin ay yung prepaid assets. So credit, prepaid, insurance. Next question, at what amount? At the expired amount. What is our expired amount? 8,000. So this should be 8,000 and this should be 8,000. So, okay. Tapos na natin yung journal entries natin, including the adjusting. How about in our expense? So, in our expense, initially, you will debit it as an expense. So, debit, insurance expense. Credit, cash, 24,000 pesos. Okay? So, we debit an insurance expense and we credit cash. Okay. In our adjusting, what is our adjusting? We should debit an asset, so we debit prepaid insurance. We credit our insurance expense. Next question, at what amount? At an expired amount. So 16,000 pesos. At an expired amount. So our unexpired amount is 16,000 pesos. So we're done now preparing for this particular example under asset method and under expense method. Guys, take note. Regarding your adjusting journal entries, you should know what method was initially used. Was it asset or was it expense? So that you will properly make your adjusting. Take note, both adjusting entries is unique on each method. So in your asset, you need to recognize an expense. On your expense, you need to recognize an asset. I already discussed to you the reason why we need to recognize an expense and why do we need to recognize an asset. Okay, so I hope you get this example. So another example. Okay, so here in our example, purchase a 3-year subscription on advertising amounting to 96,000 on January 1, 2020. The reporting date is June 30, 2020. Okay, now we need to recognize first what is the amount of our mixed account. So our mixed account is worth 96,000 pesos. Our mixed account is worth 96,000 pesos. And then we need to get for the per month value. If that is 96,000, how many months in a year? So we have here 3 years times 12 months. So how much is our per month? Our per month is 2,666.67. 2,666.67. That is our per month value. Now, after our per month value, we can now get for the expired and unexpired portion. Okay. So for the expired portion, that is through passage of time again. Kasi nga, 3-year subscription. So passage of time. So ano yung passage of time na natin? January 1, 2020, tapos June 30, 2020. So January 1 to June 30. We count the number of months. January, February, March, April, May, June. 6 months. If our expired portion is 6 months, ilan din yung unexpired natin? That is equal to 36 months less 6 months. So 30 months. And you just multiply it to the per month value, which is 2,666.67. Now we get the value for our expired. So we have here 16,000. And we have here 80,000. Okay? So after we do this, we can already make our journal entry. We can already make our journal entry. So again, asset method, and we have your expense method. So we start first with your asset method. So what is our initial journal entry? Our initial journal entry is under asset, we need to recognize an asset. So we debit a prepaid asset. and we credit cash amounting to 16,000. In our adjusting, we need to remove the prepaid asset, and we need to credit the prepaid asset, and we need to recognize an expense. Okay, so how much is our expense here? The expired portion, ano ba yan? So initially pala, 96 to. 96,000 yung value niya. So our expense is 16,000. 16,000. Okay. So since meron na tayong pro forma, pwede na natin siyang palitan talaga dun sa proper account title natin. So since this is a subscription on advertising, so pwede natin ito palitan ng prepaid advertising. Okay. Prepaid advertising. And yung expense natin, pwede natin palitan ng advertising expense. Okay? So, pagka prepayment, guys, tignan nyo lang kung ano yung purpose ng prepayment. Yan yung gagamitin ninyong term for your prepayment. So here, advertising. Kanina naman, insurance. Kaya prepaid insurance, insurance expense. Dito naman, prepaid advertising, advertising expense. Okay. So, under our expense method, initially, you will record it as an expense. So, we debit advertising expense. We credit cash at 96,000 pesos. And then on our adjusting, we debit and credit. So debit and assets. So we recognize prepaid advertising and we credit advertising expense amounting to 80,000, the unexpired portion. 80,000 unexpired portion. So let's test whether either asset method or expense method, we will yield the same amount. So, key accounts, prepaid advertising, advertising expense, prepaid advertising, advertising expense. Okay, so under our asset method, initially we have prepaid advertising of 96,000. And then on our adjusting, we debit advertising expense and we credit prepaid advertising. So the balance here of prepaid advertising is 80,000. Advertising expense is 16,000. We proceed to your expense method. Initially, we debit advertising expense of 96,000. And then subsequently, you recognize 80,000 prepaid advertising. And you decrease the advertising expense at 80,000. So prepaid advertising is 80,000. The balance of advertising expense is 16,000. 16,000. Okay. So again, either method, asset or expense, we will get the same amount. We will get the same amount. Last example. Okay. So here we prepaid the 18 months rent on a space amounting to 18,000, amounting to 18,000 on January 1, 2020. So reporting period is December 31, 2020. Okay, so 18 months rent paid on January 1. We report now on December 31, 2020. So our mixed value or mixed account value is 18,000. So how many months for 18,000? 18 months. So how much is per month? 1,000 per month. Now we look as to our expired portion and the unexpired portion. Okay, so as to the expired portion, our expired portion based on passage of time is January 1 to December 31. January 1 to December 31. So we count January 1 to December 31 is 12 months. And the value of the 12 months is, so 12 months multiplied by 1,000 is 12,000. So for our unexpired portion, since we have an 18 months time, less 12 months already expired, we have 6 months remaining multiplied by 1,000. This will give you a value of 6,000 pesos. This will give you a value of 6,000 pesos. Since we're already done separating the values as expired and unexpired, we're ready to make our entries. So we have here your asset method and your expense method. So initially under asset method, what is our entry? So we debit prepaid rent, we credit cash amounting to 18,000 pesos. And then we record our adjusting by recognizing the expired portion. So we debit rent expense, and then we credit prepaid rent amounting to 12,000, the expired portion. Now for your expense, we debit rent expense, and then we credit cash 6,000 pesos. On our adjusting, we debit an asset known as your prepaid rent, and then we credit your rent expense. Mali yung values ko. This is 18,000. 18,000. So this is 6,000. 6,000, the unexpired portion. Okay? So either method still, we will get the same amount as to our prepaid rent and our rent expense. Okay, so just a recap, if ever we are using asset method, initially you record it as an asset. Subsequently, you need to recognize an expense at the amount of expired portion. Next, under expense method, initially you recognize an expense. Subsequently, you recognize an asset at the amount of unexpired. So, yan. So, asset siya, yung adjusting mo ay expense. Expense siya, yung adjusting mo ay asset. Okay. So, when we say adjusting, what should we recognize? So, we recognize an expense in your asset. In your expense method, we recognize an asset known as your prepaid asset. Okay, so that's it for our deferrals as to either prepayments or pre-collections. We go forward and discuss now your accruals. So your accruals can either be an expense or an income. So when we say accruals, these are income or expenses earned or incurred but not yet received or paid. So in short, when we say accrued expense, this is an expense incurred but not yet paid. For our accrued income, this is an income earned but not yet receive. Okay. So what is the difference between a prepayment with a deferral and accrual? So we have here deferral, we have here accrual. Initial entry. So in your deferral, there is an initial entry. There is an initial entry. In your accrual, no initial entry. Adjusting, both has an adjusting. Both has an adjusting. Okay. So under your deferral, take note, we have an initial entry that is either asset or expense or liability or income. We already know that. While in your accrual, we don't have an initial entry, purely adjusting. Purely adjusting. So what are the adjusting pro forma entries for your accrual? So we have either accrued expense or accrued income. So, what is our adjusting? Take note guys, wala tayong initial entry dito. Purely adjusting entry. So, anong adjusting entry natin sa expense? We debit an expense and we credit a payable. For accrued income, we just debit a receivable and we credit an income. Just take note for accrued expense, if you incur it but you did not pay it. Okay. How about accrued income? You earned it, but you did not yet receive. So let's start with accrued expense and let's have some examples. Number one, unpaid salaries at year end. Amounts to 15,000. Okay, so this is an accrued expense. So if that is an accrued expense, you just debit the expense and you credit a payable. So you debit salaries expense, credit salaries payable. Sir, pwedeng accounts payable? Pwede bang accounts payable yung gagamitin namin? Pwede, depending dun sa chart of accounts. Okay. So, or accounts payable, depending on the chart of accounts. If there is a salaries payable account, then use the salaries payable account. If there's no salaries payable account, then you can use accounts payable. So here, we have unpaid expense. So we just debit salaries expense and you credit salaries payable. Utilities amounting to 12,000 pesos is not yet paid at year end. Okay? Utilities amounting to 12,000 pesos is not yet paid at year end. So here we have another unpaid. We have another unpaid expense, utilities. Okay, so how do we record it? We just debit an expense. So we debit utilities expense. And then we credit utilities payable. Okay, so 12,000. Again, if there is no utilities payable, you can use accounts payable. You can use accounts payable instead of utilities payable. So madali lang tong accrued expense. You just debit expense and you credit payable. You credit payable. How about accrued income? So under accrued income, these are income earned but not yet received. So income earned but not yet received. Okay. So let's have an example. fees earned amounting to 90,000 is unbilled. So when we say unbilled, hindi pa nakapagbayad, hindi pa natin binibill yung kliyente. Pero it is already earned. It is already earned. Since it is already earned, what is our pro forma entry again in your accrued income? We just debit a receivable and we credit an income. So our entry here is debit to accounts receivable and a credit to your fees income, 90,000. Take note guys regarding your account titles. Whatever account titles you use, so long as it is appropriate for the transaction. And in case guys, there is a chart of accounts, again, follow the chart of accounts. Follow the chart of accounts. Okay? So, purely for your accrued income, basta may income ka, pero hindi mo pa nare-receive, ang entry mo ay debit, receivable, and a credit to income. Normally, mas maraming accrued expenses kesa accrued income. Mas maraming accrued expenses kesa sa accrued income. Okay? So, we're done now discussing the two major types of adjusting entries. Those are your accruals and your deferrals. So, we proceed now to your special types of adjusting entries. Okay, so under special types of adjusting entries, these are different types of adjusting entries. However, the rules under your accruals and deferrals will be different as to the computation of the amount. Kasi di ba kanina sa deferrals, expired, unexpired, tapos earned, unearned lang tayo. Tapos doon naman sa accruals, kung magkano lang yung amount, yun na siya. Pero dito kasi, hindi siya based dun sa expired and unexpired. It is based on the use and through passage of time using a depreciation method. So we will learn all of that using these items. So special types of adjusting entries wherein we will not follow the rules based on your amount in your deferrals and your accruals. So here, first one is your depreciation. So what is your depreciation? Your depreciation is the allocation of cost of the asset over its useful life. Over its useful life. So how do we compute for your depreciation? To compute for depreciation expense, so to compute for your depreciation expense, it is equal to the book value or the purchase cost. Wag na lang book value, baka mas malito kayo pagka book value. So, purchase price less salvage value divided by useful life. Okay? Purchase price less salvage value divided by useful life. Okay. First, what is purchase price? What is the purchase price? This is the price paid to purchase the asset. What is the salvage value? The price of the asset that can be recovered at the end of its useful life. So for example, you have here an asset, sasakyan, ang useful life niya is 15 years. So after 15 years, pag binenta mo siya, tapos may makukuha pa rin, ang tawag dun ay salvage value. So kung halimbawa binenta natin yung sasakyan natin, tapos makakakuha pa rin tayo ng 50,000, yung 50,000, ang tawag natin dun ay salvage value. salvage value. Next, we have your useful life. Useful life. Okay, the term or the life of the asset. Okay. So again, depreciation is the allocation of the cost of the asset over its useful life, So to compute for your depreciation expense, it is equal to your purchase price, the salvage value over your useful life. And take note, guys, that your depreciation expense, depreciation is applicable only for depreciable asset. So we have here non-depreciable assets and depreciable. So what is your non-depreciable asset? So the main non-depreciable asset is land. Okay. When we talk about depreciable assets, we talk about property, plant, and equipment. Okay. So the items of property, plant, and equipment. So the items are land, we have your trucks, your vehicles, we have your machineries, we have your furnitures. So those are different properties, plants, and equipments. So if ever we talk about depreciation, it is only applicable for depreciable assets. Therefore, in non-depreciable property, plant, and equipment, such as land, we do not compute depreciation. So no depreciation here. While if it is depreciable, such as your building, vehicles, machinery, furniture, and fixture, okay? So if ever we have your building, vehicles, machinery, furnitures, and fixtures, etc., we compute depreciation. So depreciation is computed. Depreciation is computed. So how do we compute for your depreciation? We compute the depreciation expense equal to purchase price, the salvage value over the useful life. Purchase price, the salvage value over the useful life. Okay. So what is the adjusting journal entry for depreciation? What is the adjusting journal entry for depreciation? We debit depreciation expense. We credit accumulated depreciation. Okay. And normally, guys, the depreciation expense that we computed, again, how to compute for your depreciation expense? It is equal to purchase price, the salvage value over the life. This amount is annual. This amount is an annual depreciation. So to compute for a piecemeal depreciation, so when we say piecemeal depreciation, not 1 year, or not an annual depreciation. So if that is a piecemeal depreciation, not 1 year or not an annual depreciation, we compute it by getting the purchase price over salvage value multiplied by life, divided by life, multiplied by n over 12. N is the number of months. N is the number of months, okay? So guys, again, take note in computation of your depreciation. We have here your annual depreciation, which is equal to your purchase price over the life. Purchase price, the salvage value over the life. That is your annual depreciation. However, if we will get a piecemeal depreciation, which means that the depreciation is not 1 year or not an annual depreciation. So we have here purchase price, the salvage value over the life times n over 12. Okay, so let's have an example. Purchase a building worth 5 million pesos with salvage value of 200,000 after 30 years on January 1, 2020. Okay. Prepare adjusting entry on December 31, 2020. And then let's say August 1, 2020. So purchase a building worth 5 million with salvage value of 200,000 after 30 years on January 1, 2020. So binili niya on January 1, 2020. So let's compute first or determine first the appropriate values. So what is the purchase price? 5 million. What is the salvage value? 200,000. What is the useful life? The useful life is 30 years. So we prepare an adjusting entry on December 31, 2020. So to prepare, we just need to determine whether that is an annual period or not. So we have here January 1, 2020 to December 31, 2020. Is that 1 year? Yes, that's 1 year. Therefore, to compute, depreciation expense is equal to the purchase price of the asset, 5 million, less the salvage value of 200,000 divided by the useful life of 30 years. So what is our depreciation expense? Our depreciation expense is equal to 160,000 pesos. So what is our entry? We debit depreciation expense and we credit accumulated depreciation. 160,000 pesos. Why? Because that is an annual depreciation. How about if ever the depreciation is August 1, 2020? So 1/1/2020 to August 1. How many months? January, February, March, April, May, June, July, 7 months. So to compute for your depreciation expense, it is equal to 5 million less the salvage value of 200,000 divided by 30 years multiplied by 7 over 12. Why? 7 months over 12 because 12 is representation of 1 year. And since we only use 7 months out of the 1 year, then we will just get 7 over 12. So what's this? This is equal to 93,333.33. So we debit depreciation expense and we credit accumulated depreciation. Okay, 93,333.33. Guys, we go back to our formula. Depreciation expense is equal to purchase price the salvage value over the life. Once you get this, that is the annual depreciation. But take note, if ever guys, it is not an annual depreciation, do not forget it to multiply to n over 12. N represents the number of months. So here, in our example, we only have 7 months. So we multiplied it to 7 over 12. We multiplied it to 7 over 12. Okay? And the journal entry is debit to depreciation expense and a credit to accumulated depreciation. Debit to depreciation expense and a credit to accumulated depreciation. Okay, so guys, ang salvage value, not at all times given. Not at all times my salvage value. Okay, so not every time you can deduct a salvage value. It depends on the problem if a salvage value is given. If there is a salvage value given, then you deduct. If there is no salvage value given, then do not deduct. Okay? So take note of that. Salvage value, it does not mean that you always deduct it. It depends if the problem gives a salvage value or not. Okay? So we're done with the first special type of your adjusting entry. That is your depreciation. We proceed to the second one. We have your supplies. So supplies is still a type of prepayment. It should have been a type of prepayment wherein we can record it initially under your asset method and your expense method. Okay, so initially it can be recorded as an asset or an expense. But actually, what's hard with your supplies is the determination of the amount used and the amount unused. Okay, so if ever it is initially measured as an asset, it is measured as an asset. Your adjusting entry should be an expense, so you should record an expense at amount used. At amount used. Okay. Next, if ever you initially recorded it as an expense, your adjusting must be an asset at amount unused. Okay, so at the end of the period, the problems will only provide you what is the amount used or unused. So given yan, either used or unused. So either use or unused, yun yung ibibigay ng problem. So initially, you can record it as an asset, adjusting mo, expense at amount used. Initially, you can record it as an expense, adjusting mo, you record an asset at amount unused. Now your problem is, how do you determine the amount used and the amount unused? The amount used and the amount of unused. So at the end of the period, the given is either the use or unused. The given is use or unused. But we follow this general formula. So what is your general formula for our supplies? So we have your beginning supplies, last purchases of supplies, this will give you your total supplies. This will give you your total supplies. Less use. This is your unused. Okay? Ganyan siya. Or total supplies less unused. This is the amount used. Nasundan? Okay. So for your supplies, initially, it can be recorded as either asset or expense. But the adjusting depends whether you will record an expense or you will record an asset. For expense, you record the amount used. For an asset, you need to record the amount unused. So let's have an example. The company has beginning supplies of 3,000 and purchase additional 15,000 supplies during the period. Okay, so the company has beginning supplies of 3,000 and purchase additional 15,000 supplies during the period. At year end, the count of supplies shows 6,000. At year end, account of supplies shows 6,000. Question is, what is the given at year end? So, di ba, ang tanong, what is the given at year end? So that can either be the use or unused. So, kung titignan natin yung problem, account of supplies shows 6,000. Count of supplies. So, ibig sabihin, yun na lang yung natira. Yun na lang yung natira. So, this is the unused. 6,000. Clear? So, our unused is 6,000. So, first, we need to determine the total supplies. The total supplies will be broken down into the amount used and the amount unused. The total supplies will be broken down into your used and unused. So first, we compute our total supplies. So total supplies is equal to your beginning supplies, which is 3,000, plus your purchases on supplies amounting to 15,000, total of 18,000. So if that is the 18,000, we broke it down to your used and unused. How much is unused given in the problem? 6,000. Therefore, the difference is the use. Therefore, the difference is the use. Clear? Okay. So, assuming what is used is the asset method, assuming what is used is the asset method, what is the adjusting entry? What is the adjusting entry? We just need to recognize the expense. So, we debit supplies expense, we credit supplies. At what amount? At the amount used. So, the amount used is 12,000. What if the method used is the expense method? If the method used is the expense method, what is our adjusting entry? We debit supplies and we credit supplies expense. At what amount? The amount unused. So the amount unused is 6,000 pesos. Okay, so we go back. We said that your supplies is also a prepayment. However, what differs with this prepayment is we do not compute for the expired and unexpired through the passage of time. The problem here is that we have here your total supplies and we need to divide it as to the amount used and unused. We need to divide it as to the amount used and unused. So how do we divide that? First, we need to compute for your total supplies. So your beginning supplies plus purchases of supplies will give you your total supplies. And take note, at the end of the problem, or the problem will only provide you as to the amount of either the ending supplies, that is the unused, or the expense or the use. Clear? Okay, sabi din natin kanina, di ba? At the end of the period, ang ibibigay sa inyo ng problem is either yung nagamit na or hindi pa nagagamit. So pag nagamit na, yun yung expense. Pag hindi pa nagagamit, yun yung asset. Okay. So based on the total supplies, hahatiin natin yan dun sa nagamit at hindi nagamit. So pag nagamit yan, it is expense. Pag hindi nagamit, it is an asset. Okay, so let's have an example. The company has beginning supplies of 3,000 and purchased additional 15,000 supplies during the period. At the end, a count of supplies shows 6,000. Yung count of supplies represents unused. But before that, we need to determine the total supplies. So beginning supplies of 3,000 plus purchases on supplies of 15,000, total supplies is 18,000. If we already determined that the unused is 6,000, so our use is 12,000. Our use is 12,000. So under asset method, what is our adjusting entry? Take note, under asset method, initially it was recorded as an asset, and then subsequently you need to recognize the amount of expense at use. So we debit supplies expense, we credit supplies. We debit supplies expense, we credit supplies. At what amount? At use. So the use is 12,000. That's why we debited supplies expense at 12,000 and we credited supplies at 12,000. How about under your expense method? So under your expense method, initially, we record it as an expense. Subsequently, we need to recognize an asset at the amount unused, So our adjusting, therefore, is a debit to supplies and a credit to supplies expense. So what is the amount unused? 6,000. So debit, supplies 6,000, credit supplies expense 6,000. Okay? So mag-ingat lang kayo dito sa supplies as to computation of your total supplies. And then you need really to determine at the end of the period what is the amount of supplies used or unused depending on the tenor of the problem. Pag sinabi ng problem, ito yung nagamit na. So it means that is the use. Pag sinabi ng problem, the supplies is still on hand at the end is 6,000. So, ibig sabihin, yan yung unused. Okay? So, dapat alam lang natin hatiin yung used and unused as to our supplies. At pwede siyang i-record either under asset method or expense method. So, we can record it either on your asset method or your expense method. Okay? So, we discussed already depreciation and supplies. Next special type is your interest. Next special type is your interest. So under interest, this is a form of your accrual. So it is an accrual based on either an income or expense. Okay. So if you have a notes receivable, loans receivable, bonds receivable, generally, you will have an accrued income. Okay? So kung meron kang notes receivable, loans receivable, and bonds receivable, doon ka magkakaroon ng accrued income. Pero kung meron ka namang notes payable, loans payable, or bonds payable, doon ka naman magkakaroon ng accrued expense. Okay? Doon ka magkakaroon ng accrued expense. Okay. So itong interest, pwede pala siyang income, pwede rin siyang expense. So pagka-income, anong entry natin? E di debit, interest receivable, credit, interest income. Okay? Pag expense naman, anong entry natin? We debit, interest expense, we credit, interest payable. Okay? So, ayan yung pro forma entry natin. We debit, interest receivable, credit, interest income for income. We debit, interest expense, and credit, interest payable for expense. Kailan tayo magkakaroon ng accrued income? Pagka meron kang notes receivable, loans receivable, at bonds receivable. Accrued expense naman, notes payable, loans payable, at bonds payable. But how do we compute for the amount of our interest? Our interest is equal to the principal value multiplied by the rate multiplied by the term. Okay, so what is this principal? This is the value of the note, loans, or bonds. What is the rate? This is the interest rate. This is the interest rate. What is the term? This is the period of income or expense. Okay. So take note, guys, that the interest rate is always annual. The interest rate, this is an annual interest rate. Therefore, you need to get for a term commensurate to the period of the income or expense. Okay. So let's say, for example, on January, wag naman January, panay January na lang. On July 31, 2020, receive a note worth 50,000 bearing an interest of 6% payable after 3 years. Payable after 3 years. So on July 31, 2020, receive a note worth 50,000 bearing an interest of 6% payable after 3 years, representing the sale of goods. Okay, So you receive a note. Pagka-receive a note, anong meron dyan? So July 31, 2020. We debit note receivable and we credit sales. Why sales? Because representing the sale of goods. So magkano yung note natin? 50,000 pesos. Sir, ano yung 50,000 pesos? Yung 50,000 na yan, yan yung tinatawag nating value of notes or loans or bonds. That is the principal. That is the principal. What is the 6%? This is the interest. This is the interest rate. Okay. Of course, guys, since this is a note receivable, what do we have after? Accrued income. We will have an accrued income. So that is for our interest accrued income. So July 31. We proceed now. Let's say it's December 31, 2020. We will make our adjusting entry. So to compute for our adjusting entry, we have an interest. We have an interest income. Why interest income? Kasi nga guys, sabi natin, pagka meron kay receivable, whether notes, loans, or bonds, meron kang accrued income. Pero pagka notes payable, loans payable, or bonds payable yan, ang meron naman sa'yo ay accrued expense. So dito sa problem na to, we receive a note. Kaya meron tayong notes receivable. So to compute for your interest income, it's equal to your principal. Magkano yung principal? That is the value of the note. That is 50,000. And then, we multiply it to the rate. The rate is 6%. Next is the term. This is the period of income or expense. So ano yung period natin? That is from July 31, 2020 to December 31, 2020. Kasi nga, yan yung period lang natin. So it means, guys, na yung term or period of income or expense is the lapse of time from the issue or receipt of the note. Okay? So it is the lapse of time from the issue or receipt of the note. So we have here 50,000. You multiply it to 6%, multiplied by the term. So what is the period, guys? July 31, December 31. So August, September, October, November, December, 5 months. So this should be 5 over 12. So how much is our interest income? 50,000 times 6% times 5 over 12. We will get 1,250. 1,250. So what is our adjusting entry? Our adjusting entry is a debit to interest receivable and a credit to interest income, amounting to 1,250. Amounting to 1,250. Nasundan? Dito kasi we receive a note. We receive a note kaya meron tayong notes receivable. Notes receivable. Paano tayo mag-compute ng interest? Principal, yan yung value ng ating note, loans, or bonds. Rate, yan yung interest rate. Term, yan yung period of income or expense, or that is the lapse of time from the date that we have received the note up to the time of adjusting. So, from July 31 to December 31. Okay? Ganyan, pagka interest income. Another example for interest expense naman. For interest expense, issued a note in consideration for professional fees of the auditor amounting to 30,000. The note bears an interest of 12%. The note is issued on June 1, 2020. June 1, 2020. And payable after 1 year. Okay. So Let's answer this problem. Issued a note in consideration for professional fees of the auditor amounting to 30,000. The note bears an interest of 12%. The note is issued on June 1, 2020 and payable after 1 year. Okay, so we determine what is the principal. So what is the principal, guys? The value of the note, 30,000. And then what is the rate? The rate is 12%. And what is the term? That is the lapse of time from the time of issue up to the date of adjusting. So let's remember that our date of adjusting will be December 31, 2020. So the term will be from June 1 to December 31. So June, July, August, September, October, November, December. So 7 months. So we compute for your interest. Interest is equal to your 30,000 multiplied by the rate, 12%, multiplied by the term, which is 7 over 12. 7 over 12. So what is the amount of our interest? So 30,000 times 12 times 7 over 12 will give us 2,100. 2,100. So take note here, we issued a note. Pagka nag-issue ka ng note, meron ka namang payable. Meron kang payable. So let's make the journal entries. So journal entry on June 1, our entry is debit to professional expenses, professional fees or expense amounting to 30,000. And then we credit notes payable amounting to 30,000. And then guys, we will make our adjusting entry on December 31. Our adjusting entry is a debit to interest expense and a credit to interest payable amounting to 2,100. Sir, why did we recognize an interest expense? Remember guys that we go back here. Her interest expense is recognized if there is a notes payable, loans payable, or bonds payable. Ayan siya, expense siya. Pero magiging asset siya or income pagka receivable, loans receivable, or bonds receivable. So sir, kailan namin masasabi na payable siya? Guys, it is payable. Kailan natin masasabi na notes, loans, or bonds payable siya pagka ang word na ginamit ay issued. So if you issued or paid using notes, loans, or bonds, then that is payable. But if ever notes, loans, or bonds receivable, dito naman there must be a receipt or receive. Okay. So pag nakalagay dun sa problem na receipt or receive note, ibig sabihin meron kang receivable. So kung may receivable ka, meron kang income. Kung may payable ka, meron kang expense. Ano uli yung journal entry natin dito? We debit interest expense and we credit interest payable. Dito naman sa income, we debit interest receivable and we credit interest income. Okay? So, ingat lang guys as to your interest. And how do we compute for your interest? Interest is equal to principal times rate times term. And the term or time is the lapse of time from the date of receipt or issuance up to the date of adjustment. Okay? So, ingat sa pagbilang ng months. Ingat sa pagbilang ng months. Okay? So, we're done with depreciation. We're done with supplies and interest. Last type of special adjusting entry is your doubtful accounts. Last special type of adjusting entry is your doubtful accounts. So what is your doubtful accounts? So your doubtful accounts is an allowance for possible uncollectible accounts. Okay, it is an allowance for possible uncollectible accounts receivable. So in case you will not collect your accounts receivable, then you can provide for an allowance. So this is known as your allowance for doubtful accounts. Allowance for doubtful accounts. Okay, so under your allowance for doubtful accounts, guys, you need to recognize as an adjusting entry. Your normal adjusting entry is e-debit to doubtful accounts expense. And e-credit to allowance for doubtful accounts. Allowance for doubtful accounts. So on your doubtful accounts expense, guys, pwede rin naman ang gamitin nyo dito ay bad debt expense. Pwede nyo gamitin na bad debt expense din. Dito sa allowance for doubtful accounts, pwedeng allowance for bad debts. Pero sana naman, guys, be consistent. Kung bad debt expense ang ginamit nyo, dapat allowance for bad debts. Huwag bad debt expense credit allowance for doubtful accounts kasi hindi na consistent yung account title natin. So kung doubtful accounts expense ang ginamit, kailangan yung allowance mo ay allowance for doubtful accounts. Kung bad debt expense yung ginamit, kailangan ang gamitin mong word ay ang term na gamitin mo ay allowance for bad debts. Ang term na gamitin mo ay allowance for bad debts. Nasundan? Okay. So how to determine the allowance? How to determine the allowance? So we have your percentage of sales and percentage of AR. So ito na lang muna yung ituturo natin sa inyo kasi since basic accounting pa lang tayo. Percentage of sales is known as your income statement approach. And percentage of AR is known as your balance sheet approach. Percentage of sales is known as your income statement approach. Percentage of AR is known as your balance sheet approach. Okay, so why is it known as your income statement approach? So percentage of sales is based on a percentage of our sales actually. And it is known as income statement approach because whatever amount computed is the amount of provision. Whatever amount computed is the amount of provision. So when we say provision, this is the amount of expense. Okay? While in your percentage of AR balance sheet approach, whatever amount computed is the ending allowance. Ending allowance. So there is a need to compute for the amount of provision. Okay. Guys, pag percentage of sales, wala na tayong problema. Kung magkano man yung amount nga, yun na yung expense natin. So debit doubtful accounts, expense, credit, allowance for doubtful accounts. Pero pag percentage of AR yung ginamit ninyo, problema ang pag-compute ng expense. So ang makukuha mo kasi doon is yung ending allowance. So there is a need to compute for the amount of the provision. Okay. So how does your allowance for doubtful accounts looks like? Allowance for doubtful accounts. Okay. So we have here your beginning allowance for doubtful accounts. Why? Because allowance for doubtful accounts is a contra asset account. Contra asset or contra receivable. So when we say contra asset or contra receivable, it decreases accounts receivable. It decreases accounts receivable. It's the same with allowance or accumulated depreciation. So a while back, we discussed accumulated depreciation. So if ever we have accumulated depreciation that is a contra asset account, it decreases your property, plant, and equipment. Okay, so have here your beginning allowance for doubtful accounts. We have here your provision. And then we have here your write-off. And we have here your recovery. Okay, sir, what is a write-off? Write-off is whenever the account is really uncollectible. So account receivable or AR is really uncollectible. AR is actually uncollectible. So when we say write-off, we remove the accounts receivable. Recovery, previously written off uncollectible account, is collected or recovered. And then we have here your ending allowance for doubtful accounts. Okay. So here, our main adjusting entry is a debit to doubtful accounts expense and a credit to allowance for doubtful accounts. And how do we determine the balance, or how do we determine the allowance? We use your percentage of sales or percentage of AR. So under percentage of sales, income statement approach, whatever amount computed, that is the amount of provision or expense. Percentage of AR, balance sheet approach, whatever amount computed is the ending allowance. So there is a need to compute for the amount of provision. Because ito yung problema natin, di ba? This is the doubtful accounts expense. Yan yung kailangan natin computein. So pag na-compute na natin using percentage of sales, walang problema. Paano kung percentage of AR yung binigay, edi kailangan mong computein yung doubtful accounts expense. Take note guys ha, these are methods. Therefore, pwedeng percentage of sales yung ibigay ng problem or percentage of AR. Okay, so let's have an example. So let's say your net sales is 3 million pesos. AR ending amounts to 400,000 pesos. And then you have a allowance for doubtful accounts beginning of 2,000 pesos. 2,000 pesos. And then we will use your percentage of AR. So let's say your percentage of AR is 2%. Percentage of AR is 2%. So we need to make our adjusting entry. So how do we apply your percentage of AR? So sabi natin yung percentage of AR, ang makukuha natin dyan is yung off the end, di ba? Ang makukuha natin is off the end. Sir, ano yung off the? Allowance for doubtful accounts. So pag ginamit natin yung percentage of AR, ang makukuha natin ay off the end. So paano ba natin i-compute? If this is equal to your AR balance end multiplied by the percentage. So our AR end is 400,000. And our percentage of AR is 2%. So we will get 8,000. 8,000. Take note, pagka percentage of AR, ang makukuha mo ay ito yung off the end. Ito yung off the end. So you need to compute for the provision. So kailangan natin kunin yung T account ng AFDA. So what is the beginning of the 2,000? Ano yung ending AFDA natin? 8,000. So, kailangan natin kunin dito yung provision. Tama ba? Provision. So, magkano yung kulang para maging 8,000 siya? 6,000. 6,000 yung kulang para maging 8,000 siya. So, ano yung entry din natin? Debit, doubtful accounts expense. Credit, allowance for doubtful accounts. Amounting to 6,000, the value computed as your provision. Okay? So, ulitin natin. Sabi natin sa percentage of AR, balance sheet approach, whatever amount computed is the ending balance of the allowance. So there is a need to compute for the amount of provision. Bakit? Kasi nga yung provision yung ating doubtful accounts expense. The provision is the doubtful accounts expense. So dito sa ating example, kinompute muna natin yung percentage of AR. That is 400,000 multiplied by 2%, 8,000. Tapos, i-compute natin after yung provision. Paano natin i-compute yung provision gamit yung T account na tinuro natin kanina? So, ang given lang naman ay beginning of the. Tapos, sabi natin, kung ano mako-compute sa percentage of AR, yun yung ending of the 8,000. So, kung kailangan mo ay 8,000, ang beginning ay 2,000, magkano din yung provision mo? Ang difference ay 6,000. So, yun yung ating doubtful accounts expense. Yun yung ating doubtful accounts expense. So, debit, doubtful accounts expense, and credit, allowance for doubtful accounts. So, debit, doubtful accounts expense, and credit to allowance for doubtful accounts. Okay? That's for percentage of AR. So, let's have another example for percentage of sales naman. So, let's say we still have your sales of 3 million. We have your AR end at 400,000. We have your AFDA beginning of 2,000. So your percentage of sales, sabi, is 0.5%. 0.5%. Sabi natin, guys, kung ano man yung makukuha nating percentage of sales, this is the provision. This is the provision. So paano ba natin kukunin to? This is equal to your sales multiplied by the percentage. So our sales is 3 million multiplied by 0.5%. Multiplied by 0.5%. So we have here 15,000. Okay, 15,000. Ano tong 15,000? Yan na yung amount ng ating provision. So since provision na yan, hindi na natin kailangan gamitin yung ating AFDA account. Kung magkano na yung na-compute, yun na yung amount. So doubtful accounts expense, credit, allowance for doubtful accounts, 15,000. Ayan. Okay? So, napansin niyo dun sa ating percentage of AR, ayan, dito sa example na to. Ito yung example 1 natin, di ba? Example 1. Ito yung example 2. Okay. Dun sa example 1 natin, percentage of AR, tama? So, kung ano yung makukuha natin yun, dun yung ending niya. So, nilagay natin siya sa end. Nag-compute tayo ng provision. So, parang 2-step siya. Ending mo na, tapos provision. Pero sa percentage of sales, kung ano yung mako-compute, yun na yung provision. So, hindi mo na kailangan pang gamitin yung T account. Okay? So, mag-ingat kayo dito, guys, as to the method. Kung percentage of AR ba siya or percentage of sales. But take note, what do we need to make an entry for? That is your doubtful accounts expense. We need to make an entry as to our doubtful accounts expense. Okay? So that's it for our adjusting entries. You already learned the general types of adjusting entries. We have your deferrals and accruals. We also learned about your special types, such as your supplies, your depreciation, your interest, and your doubtful accounts. Okay, thank you.